While I was in Sydney, I couldn't help but think of a young woman named Pamela, who exactly 100 years ago left that beautiful city to travel to London. She did so when she was only a little older than.
For 30 years, Andrew Parker Bowles kept a devastating secret about their divorce. Everyone blamed Prince Charles, but they got it completely wrong. When Camilla returned home one night, she told Andrew 5 brutal words that exposed a shocking truth. He filed for divorce immediately. What happened behind closed doors will make your jaw drop. At 85, Andrew is finally breaking his silence. And what he reveals about Camilla's master plan is absolutely chilling. You won't believe what she admitted.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it,
Food banks on the rise.
Yeah, it's appalling, and you think, what can we all do to help this? It's Christmas is for all very lucky and have a wonderful Christmas with family, but the idea that this country still has people starving their food banks is disgusting.
Andrew Parker Bowles, now 85 years old, was once married to Camilla, the current Queen Consort. Their divorce in 1995 became one of the most discussed separations of the 20th century, though not for the reasons most people assume. For years, the public narrative surrounding their split seemed straightforward and almost romantic in its tragedy. Andrew was portrayed as the decent military officer who loved his wife but simply could not compete with the enduring connection between Camilla and Prince Charles. The story we were told suggested that Camilla had been torn between duty to her marriage and her feelings for her first love, ultimately choosing the man she could never forget. According to this version of events, Andrew stepped aside with dignity and grace, allowing Camilla to follow what many described as her destiny. There were no ugly public confrontations, no bitter accusations splashed across newspaper front pages, and no messy court battles over assets or custody. Instead, the marriage ended quietly, almost nobly, as though it had simply run its natural course under the weight of impossible circumstances. The press repeated this narrative, the public accepted it, and over time it became the established version of history. This telling of events had a certain appeal. It was bittersweet and inevitable, the kind of story that fits neatly into our understanding of royal drama. A woman caught between 2 men, one representing stability and respectability, the other representing passion and a connection that transcended time. In this framework, Andrew Parker Bowles became a sympathetic but ultimately minor character, a good man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. His silence over the years only seemed to confirm this interpretation. He never gave interviews about the divorce, never wrote a tell-all memoir, and never made any public attempts to challenge the narrative that had formed around him. But that silence, it turns out, was hiding something far more complicated than anyone realized. In a private interview that has only recently come to light, Andrew Parker Bowles has offered a revelation that fundamentally changes our understanding of what happened. According to Andrew, King Charles was never actually the real problem. If the situation had been simply about Charles, he says, he could have lived with it. He could have endured the pain of knowing his wife still had feelings for an old flame. What he could not endure, and what ultimately destroyed their marriage, was something entirely different. The real reason for the collapse of their relationship, Andrew insists, was not about a single man, but about a transformation. It was about watching the woman he had married slowly become someone else entirely. This is the part of the story that the public never saw and never heard about until now. The warm, quick-witted, and irreverent woman Andrew fell in love with gradually changed into someone whose priorities, loyalties, and very nature shifted in ways that left no room for him in her life. This transformation, according to Andrew, was not simply about romance or rekindled feelings. It was about something more calculated and deliberate. It was about power, position, and ambition. It was about the quiet, strategic steps a person takes when they decide to pursue a life that requires them to become someone fundamentally different from who they once were. And in that process of becoming, Andrew found himself not just competing with another man for his wife's affections, but being slowly written out of a story he thought he was meant to be part of. For nearly 30 years, Andrew Parker Bowles played the role assigned to him by history and circumstance. He became the background figure in what the media love to call Britain's most famous love triangle. While Charles and Camilla's relationship was analysed, debated, criticised, and eventually accepted, Andrew remained silent. He did not fight for his place in the narrative. He did not try to reclaim his version of events. He simply stepped back and lived his life away from the constant scrutiny that follows anyone connected to the royal family. That silence, however, should not be mistaken for acceptance or agreement with the official story. It was instead a choice, a decision to maintain his dignity rather than engage in a public battle he likely could not win. In a world where the monarchy controls so much of its own narrative, where palace officials carefully manage every detail of how royal stories are told, Andrew understood that speaking out might accomplish nothing except turning his private pain into public entertainment. But now, at 85, Andrew has decided that silence is no longer necessary or appropriate. His decision to speak is not motivated by bitterness or a desire for revenge, according to those who have heard his account. Instead, it comes from a place of wanting to set the record straight, to ensure that history does not completely erase his experience or the truth of what happened behind closed doors. He wants people to understand that the dissolution of his marriage was not the simple romantic tragedy it has been made out to be. What Andrew reveals challenges the comfortable story we have been told. It suggests that the breakdown of his marriage to Camilla was not an unfortunate casualty of true love conquering all obstacles. Instead, it was the result of deliberate choices, calculated moves, and a transformation driven by ambition rather than emotion alone. This version of events paints a very different picture of Camilla, not as a woman helplessly drawn back to her first love, but as someone who carefully positioned herself for a role that would eventually lead to the crown. The implications of Andrew's account extend beyond just one failed marriage. They touch on larger questions about the nature of royal relationships, the price of ambition, and the human costs that often hide behind the polished public images of the British monarchy. They also raise questions about how history gets written, whose voices get heard, and whose sacrifices go unacknowledged in the official telling of royal romances. As we look deeper into Andrew Parker Bowles' story, we begin to see not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a carefully executed plan. We see a woman who recognized an opportunity and took the necessary steps to seize it, even if those steps meant leaving behind the life and the man she had built a family with. And we see a man who for 3 decades chose dignity and silence over spectacle, only now deciding that the truth deserves to be heard. In the late 1960s, Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla Shand represented everything that high society Britain admired. Andrew was a rising star in the British Army, tall and broad-shouldered, embodying every characteristic of what people imagined when they thought of an English gentleman and officer. His military career was already showing promise, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence and poise that opened doors in the most exclusive circles. Camilla, for her part, was radiant and spirited, known among her peers for her quick wit and natural charm. She had an ability to put people at ease that made her popular wherever she went, and unlike many women in her social class, she seemed genuinely uninterested in pretense or affectation. Together, they were exactly the kind of couple that made for excellent gossip in aristocratic circles, but in the best possible way. They were frequently photographed at polo matches, their laughter captured as they mingled at garden parties, and they glided through elegant dinners hosted by some of Britain's most powerful and influential families. Andrew's military uniform attracted admiring glances, while Camilla's easy warmth made her stand out even in rooms full of people trained from birth in the art of social graces. To anyone watching from the outside, they seemed like a perfect match, destined for a long and happy marriage. On paper, the pairing made complete sense. Andrew brought discipline, prestige, and the respect that came with being a decorated military officer. Camilla offered charisma, social intelligence, and the kind of natural poise that allowed her to navigate any social situation with apparent ease. Their backgrounds were compatible, their social circles overlapped naturally, and they seemed genuinely fond of each other. Friends and family saw them as one of those rare couples who had everything going for them, and many assumed their marriage would be one of the enduring success stories of their generation. But as anyone who has lived long enough knows, appearances can be deceiving, and what looks perfect from the outside often conceals complications that only those directly involved can see. Even during those early years of courtship and the first years of marriage, there were signs that things were not quite as golden as they appeared. These signs were subtle at first, the kind of thing that might not register as significant to outsiders, but that accumulated over time into something more troubling. Andrew, for all his charm and public appeal, had a weakness that was fairly well known within their social circle, though it was never discussed openly in polite company. He was not always faithful to Camilla. In the world they inhabited, where discretion was valued above almost everything else, infidelity was often tolerated as long as it was handled with appropriate care and never became public knowledge. Many marriages in their circle operated under an unspoken understanding that certain behaviors would be overlooked as long as they did not create embarrassment or scandal. Camilla, however, was not oblivious to Andrew's failings. She noticed the signs, the unexplained absences, the careful arrangements, the way certain names would come up in conversation and then be quickly changed. She was intelligent and perceptive enough to understand what was happening, even if the details were kept from her. But Andrew's infidelity was not the only shadow hanging over their marriage, even before it had properly begun. Camilla herself carried emotional baggage that would prove significant. Her connection with Prince Charles had officially ended by the time she married Andrew, but emotionally, it had never fully been resolved. This was not simply the kind of wistful nostalgia that most people have for a past relationship, the fond memories of what might have been. Instead, it was something deeper and more persistent, a bond that she could not seem to completely let go of, no matter how much time passed or how committed she appeared to be to her marriage. Andrew began noticing signs of this lingering connection almost from the beginning of their marriage. There were letters that would arrive and disappear before he had a chance to see what they contained. Phone calls taken behind closed doors, with Camilla's voice dropping to a whisper that made it clear the conversation was meant to be private. Invitations to events at royal estates that seemed specifically designed for Camilla rather than for them as a couple, as though someone was finding ways to ensure she would be present whether Andrew could attend or not. At first, Andrew tried to dismiss these signs. Their lives were busy and complicated, filled with social obligations that seemed never-ending. They were raising children, in a world where maintaining appearances mattered more than addressing private feelings, and Andrew told himself that whatever lingering connection Camilla had to Charles was harmless, a remnant of the past that would fade with time. But the emotional distance between them persisted, subtle but unmistakable, like feeling a draft in what should be a sealed room, but being unable to locate its source. In public, they maintained the image of an unshakable couple. They smiled for photographs, toasted champagne with friends at countless events, and held hands in front of watchful eyes that were always looking for any sign of trouble in prominent marriages. But behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the carefully managed social appearances, the warmth that had once characterized their relationship began to fade. This decline was not marked by dramatic arguments or explosive confrontations. Instead, it was quieter and perhaps more devastating because of that quietness. There were fewer shared jokes between them, conversations became shorter and more functional, and an ever-present sense developed that they were living parallel lives rather than a shared one. The seeds of their future troubles had been planted during these early years, even though neither of them might have fully recognized it at the time. What the world saw as a fairy tale romance was actually a carefully staged performance, one that required constant effort to maintain. Both Andrew and Camilla were playing roles that they had been trained by their upbringing to play, presenting a united front to the world while privately grappling with doubts, disappointments, and divided loyalties. The social world they inhabited made it difficult to address these issues directly. Honest conversations about feelings and needs were not encouraged in their circles. Instead, there was an expectation that people would simply carry on, maintaining the facade regardless of what they were experiencing privately. This culture of silence and discretion while protecting reputations and preventing scandals also prevented couples from addressing problems before they became insurmountable. Looking back at this period, it becomes clear that the foundation of their marriage was already weakening, even as they continued to present themselves as the picture of aristocratic stability. The dual problems of Andrew's infidelity and Camilla's unresolved feelings for Charles created a situation where neither person was fully present in the marriage, even though both continued to go through the motions. They were both looking elsewhere for something, whether it was excitement, validation, or emotional connection, and this meant that the partnership they had formed was built on increasingly unstable ground. The tragedy of this period is that from the outside, everything still looked fine. Their friends saw a successful couple, their children had parents who provided for them and maintained a stable home, and Society pages continued to feature them as exemplars of their class. But underneath that carefully maintained surface, the marriage was already beginning its slow dissolution, a process that would take years to complete, but that had begun almost from the very start. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, cracks were appearing in two prominent marriages, and these fault lines ran uncomfortably close to each other. Prince Charles and Princess Diana, whose wedding had been watched by millions around the world and hailed as a modern fairy tale, were clearly struggling. Their public appearances had become noticeably strained, with smiles that looked forced and body language that suggested distance rather than intimacy. Anyone paying close attention could see that something was wrong, and whispers began circulating in royal circles about separate lives, emotional disconnect, and a marriage that was buckling under the enormous pressure placed upon it. In that growing emotional vacuum, Prince Charles turned back to the one person who had always seemed to understand him in a way that others did not. Camilla Parker Bowles had known Charles before his marriage to Diana, and their connection had never entirely disappeared, even during the years when it had been pushed into the background. As Charles's marriage deteriorated in full view of the British public and international media, his relationship with Camilla began to move out of the shadows and back into a more prominent place in his life. For Andrew Parker Bowles, the change in his own marriage became impossible to ignore. At first, Camilla's renewed closeness with Charles manifested in relatively discreet ways. There were occasional phone calls, shared attendance at certain events, conversations that Andrew was not privy to. But as the situation between Charles and Diana worsened and became more public, the connection between Camilla and the future king grew more visible and more consuming of Camilla's time and attention. Princess Diana herself famously acknowledged the situation in a television interview, stating that there were 3 people in her marriage, making it rather crowded. That admission sent shockwaves through Britain and confirmed what many had suspected. But while the world focused on how Camilla's relationship with Charles affected Diana, few people considered how it was affecting Andrew, who was watching his own marriage unravel from a very different vantage point. Andrew saw the changes not only in newspaper headlines, but in the small details of daily life. Phone calls would end abruptly when he entered a room, as though he had interrupted something that was not meant for his ears. Invitations would arrive for events where Camilla's name appeared on the guest list, but he did not, suggesting that someone was arranging things specifically to ensure her presence without requiring his. Even Camilla's demeanor began to shift in ways that Andrew found troubling. She seemed more alert, more careful, more deliberate in her choices and actions, as though every decision was being weighed against some larger plan. Andrew has insisted, both then and now, that Charles himself was not the central problem. In his own words, if it had been only about Charles and a romantic connection, he could have lived with that reality. Affairs, whether physical or emotional, were an uncomfortable but recognized aspect of the world they lived in. What disturbed Andrew far more than Charles's presence in Camilla's life was the transformation he began to observe in Camilla herself. The woman he had married had possessed a refreshing irreverence toward the pomposity of aristocratic and royal life. She had been quick to mock rigid traditions, to roll her eyes at the obsession with titles and formalities, to laugh at the absurdity of certain social expectations. That quality had been part of what made her so appealing, her ability to navigate high society while maintaining a sense of humor about its more ridiculous aspects. But now that irreverence was disappearing, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like ambition. Slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, Camilla's attitude toward royal life began to shift. She stopped making jokes about palace protocols and started studying them. She became more interested in understanding how the system worked, who held influence, and how one might position oneself within that complex social and political structure. Andrew watched as his wife transformed from an amused outsider into someone who seemed determined to become an insider, someone who could not just survive in the royal world, but thrive within it. As Prince Charles's marriage continued its very public collapse, Camilla's position in his life became increasingly prominent, and her own ambitions began to crystallize into something Andrew could no longer ignore. She started cultivating closer relationships with people who shaped royal narratives, including palace aides, press officers, and influential friends of the royal family. Her schedule became more strategic, with appearances that seemed calculated to achieve specific goals rather than simply fulfill social obligations. Andrew discovered physical evidence of this transformation that confirmed his growing suspicions. Tucked away in Camilla's study, he found folders filled with newspaper clippings about the royal family. There were notes written in her handwriting, detailing who would be present at upcoming events and which members of the press might attend. There were lists of influential names, including palace aides, political allies, and longtime friends of Charles, with observations scribbled alongside them about how best to approach these individuals. The Camilla who had once laughed at royal traditions was now studying them with the dedication of someone preparing for an examination. She was not just learning about royal protocol and expectations, she was mastering them. Andrew watched as she became increasingly skilled at reading social situations, positioning herself where cameras would capture her most favorably, and crafting conversations that would linger in the minds of the right people. Every choice seemed purposeful, every move appeared to be part of a larger strategy. For Andrew, this transformation was both chilling and undeniable. He began to realize that what he was witnessing was not simply a woman rekindling a romance with an old flame. Instead, he was watching someone deliberately reshape herself to become the kind of person who could stand beside a future king in a way that both the monarchy and eventually the British public might accept. This was not about emotion alone. It was about calculation, strategy, and a kind of long-term planning that suggested Camilla had a very clear vision of where she wanted to end up. In their private life, the warmth that had once existed between Andrew and Camilla cooled considerably. The shared jokes that had punctuated their evenings together fell silent. Conversations became shorter and more functional, focused on practical matters like children's schedules and household management rather than deeper emotional connection. The easy intimacy that had once defined their relationship, even during difficult periods, was replaced by an atmosphere of calculation and distance, as though Andrew was speaking to someone who was already emotionally absent from their marriage. It was during this period that Andrew began to truly understand his position. He was no longer Camilla's partner in building a shared future. Instead, he had become part of her past, a chapter in her life that had served its purpose but was no longer necessary for where she intended to go. The realization was painful, not just because his marriage was ending, but because of what that ending revealed about how Camilla viewed their entire history together. According to Andrew, the shift was not sudden or impulsive. It was a slow, deliberate pivot that had been executed carefully over a period of years. Love had been quietly replaced with ambition, and their marriage had transformed from a genuine partnership into something more strategic. Andrew came to believe that Camilla had not simply fallen back in love with Charles as a person, but had fallen for what being with Charles represented: the power, the position, the place in history that came with being the partner of Britain's future king. The breaking point came one evening after Camilla returned from yet another private visit with Charles. What began as a simmering argument, fueled by years of accumulated resentment and unspoken frustrations, escalated into a moment of brutal honesty. Without hesitation or apparent emotion, Camilla delivered a statement that would strip away any remaining illusions Andrew had about their marriage. She told him, in essence, that he had been a bridge to somewhere else, not the final destination. The words were delivered coldly, and matter-of-factly, without anger but also without apology, simply as a statement of fact. In that instant, Andrew's mind replayed their entire shared history through a devastating new lens. Their courtship, their wedding vows, the home they had built together, the children they had raised, all of it suddenly appeared in a different light. Had their entire marriage been nothing more than a temporary arrangement, a holding pattern while Camilla waited for the life she truly wanted to become accessible? Andrew has said that what hurt most was not the confirmation that Camilla still loved Charles. He had suspected that for years and had made a kind of peace with it. The truly devastating realization was that their marriage might have been part of a long, calculated strategy from the beginning. That he had been chosen not primarily for love, but because he fit a particular moment in time. A respectable and well-connected military officer who could provide stability and respectability, until an opportunity to be with Charles became politically and socially viable. That revelation cut deeper than any tabloid scandal or public humiliation could have. Infidelity could potentially be forgiven, and even unrequited love could be endured with dignity. But to discover that the life they had shared together, with all its milestones, laughter, struggles, and intimate moments, might have been viewed by his partner as merely a stepping stone towards something else that represented a betrayal that went far beyond simple unfaithfulness. Andrew says that something fundamental closed inside him that night. Not rage, not even traditional heartbreak, but a final, clear understanding. The partnership he had believed in, the marriage he had invested in, was gone, and perhaps it had never truly existed in the way he had imagined. From that point forward, his presence in the marriage became purely formal. They still appeared together when social obligations required it, still maintained appearances for the sake of their children and their social position. But internally, Andrew had already left the relationship. When he finally made the official decision to end the marriage, there was no dramatic confrontation or public airing of grievances, just a quiet, devastating acknowledgement that his role in Camilla's story had reached its conclusion. When Andrew Parker Bowles finally decided to end his marriage to Camilla, he held in his hands the kind of story that could have dominated headlines for months. He had witnessed firsthand the development of one of the most controversial relationships in modern royal history. He had experienced personal betrayal, watched his marriage dissolve while his wife grew closer to the future king, and came to believe that their entire relationship had been part of a calculated strategy. In the hands of someone seeking revenge or public vindication, this story could have been absolutely explosive, the kind of scandal that tabloids build, entire careers around. But Andrew chose a fundamentally different path. There were no exclusive interviews with major newspapers, no unnamed sources carefully feeding damaging information to journalists, and no tell-all memoir with sensational chapter titles designed to maximize sales and publicity. Instead, Andrew stepped back not just from his marriage to Camilla, but from the entire royal circus that had surrounded their life together. He made a conscious decision to exit quietly, with whatever dignity he could preserve in a situation that had stripped away so much else. The palace, ever mindful of public perception and deeply invested in controlling narratives around the royal family, strongly preferred this approach. A quiet divorce suited everyone involved in the official machinery of royal life. It meant no trials conducted in the media, no televised breakdowns of the marriage with lawyers arguing in public, and no detailed apportioning of blame that might damage reputations or complicate future plans. The divorce was finalized in January 1995 with minimal fanfare, wrapped in polite legal language that made it seem almost routine. In the official announcements, there was no mention of irreconcilable differences or any hint of betrayal or strategic maneuvering. The wording was deliberately bland and unrevealing, crafted to suggest that their 2 decades together had simply run their natural course, as some marriages do. To most members of the public who were not paying particularly close attention, that is exactly how it appeared. Just another aristocratic marriage that had not worked out, nothing particularly unusual or scandalous about it. But behind that carefully maintained facade of civility, Andrew was navigating something far more personally devastating. He was not just dealing with the loss of a marriage, painful as that would be under any circumstances. He was also experiencing the erasure of his place in a story that had defined a significant portion of his adult life. For years, he had been Camilla's partner and husband, standing at her side during family milestones, sharing in the responsibilities and joys of raising their children, moving through the same exclusive social circles that now seemed to be closing ranks around Camilla and Charles. After the divorce, those social circles shifted in ways that left Andrew increasingly on the outside. Invitations that had once been extended to both of them now went only to Camilla. Conversations at social gatherings would pause awkwardly when he approached, as though people were unsure how to acknowledge him now that his role had changed. Friends who had been shared became, in many cases, more loyal to Camilla, or more interested in maintaining connections to someone who was clearly going to remain close to the royal family. Rather than fight for visibility or attempt to maintain his position in those circles through force of will, Andrew chose to embrace absence. He returned his focus to his military commitments, where his reputation and accomplishments stood on their own merit rather than being tied to his former wife. He poured himself into a quieter domestic life, eventually remarrying a woman named Rosemary Pittman, with whom he could build something new that was not shadowed by royal connections or public scrutiny. People who knew Andrew during this period have said that it was only in this new chapter of his life, far removed from the constant attention and pressure, that he truly began to breathe freely again. Still, the public memory of his marriage and his role in the royal drama faded with remarkable speed. Documentaries about the relationship between Charles and Camilla rarely mentioned Andrew beyond a brief acknowledgement that Camilla had been married before. Articles analysing the royal romance reduced him to a footnote if they mentioned him at all. It was as if the man who had once shared Camilla's life, who had been present for the birth of their children and built a home with her, had been quietly edited out of the official history. The narrative that took hold in popular culture had no real place for him except as an obstacle that had been overcome, a temporary impediment on the path to Charles and Camilla's eventual union. Andrew never attempted to correct this record or insert himself back into the narrative, at least not until very recently. His decades of silence were not born from weakness or an inability to articulate his experience. Instead, they represented a deliberate choice, a decision that his dignity and peace of mind were worth more than any headline or moment of public attention. In a culture where every private pain can be instantly transformed into public entertainment, where personal tragedies are consumed as spectacle by millions of strangers, Andrew decided that some things were worth keeping private. While Andrew faded from public view, two enduring connections to that world remained through his children, with Camilla. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes grew up navigating an unusual position, with one foot planted firmly in British aristocracy and the other inevitably touching the edge of the royal court through their mother's relationship with Prince Charles. Tom, the elder of the two, was born in December 1974 and carried an interesting distinction from birth. His godfather was Prince Charles himself, a connection that after his parents' divorce took on complicated resonance. But Tom never relied on that royal association to define his identity or career. Instead, he carved out a reputation in an entirely different field, establishing himself as a respected food writer and critic. His work appeared in prestigious publications including Esquire UK and The Mail on Sunday, and he authored several well-received cookbooks that combined personal insights with culinary expertise. Tom also became a familiar face on culinary television programs, where he served as a judge and brought a combination of aristocratic ease and genuine knowledge to his appearances. When Camilla was crowned Queen Consort, Tom's son Freddie served as a page of honor during the ceremony, a role that briefly thrust the younger generation into the spotlight. Tom spoke about the coronation in an interview, emphasizing that regardless of her royal position, Camilla remained fundamentally their mother. He pushed back against suggestions that her relationship with Charles had been part of some calculated endgame, insisting instead that she had simply married the person she loved. Laura, born in January 1978, chose an even more private path than her brother. After completing her studies at Oxford Brookes University, she immersed herself in the art world, eventually managing galleries and later co-founding her own gallery called 11 in the upscale Belgravia neighborhood. In 2006, Laura married Harry Lopes, a former model who had transitioned into work in renewable energy. Together they have 3 children, a daughter named Eliza and twin boys, Gus and Louis. Like their cousin Freddie, the twins also participated in Camilla's coronation ceremony as pages of honor. Despite their mother's extraordinary position as Queen Consort, both Tom and Laura have managed to maintain a careful balance between acknowledging their connection to the royal family and living lives that are substantially their own. They attend major family events and important royal occasions, but for the most part they exist outside the constant scrutiny and pressure that defines life for working members of the royal family. For Andrew, watching his children successfully navigate these two very different worlds has been a source of quiet pride. From his position outside the spotlight, Andrew has watched the decades unfold with a perspective few others possess. He has seen the gradual rehabilitation of Camilla's public image, her transformation from the most hated woman in Britain to someone eventually accepted and even embraced by many as Queen Consort. He has watched headlines soften over time, photographs grow warmer, and public opinion shift from hostility to something approaching affection. The scandal that once seemed insurmountable has been reframed in popular culture as a love story that ultimately found its happy ending. In the official narrative that has solidified over these years, Andrew's role has been reduced to almost nothing. When he appears at all in documentaries or articles about Charles and Camilla, it is as a polite footnote, the dignified ex-husband who gracefully stepped aside so that history could take its intended course. But Andrew knows that history is never quite that simple or neat. When Andrew speaks about this now, there is no obvious bitterness colouring his words, but rather a kind of sober, clear-eyed understanding. He does not deny Camilla's intelligence, her adaptability, or the resilience she demonstrated in pursuing what she wanted despite enormous public hostility. He simply observes that those qualities, admirable as they might be in some contexts, came at a significant cost to both of them. In pursuing her place beside Charles and ultimately her position as queen, Camilla gained the crown and the power that comes with it. And Andrew, in his turn, lost more than a wife. He lost the partnership he had believed they were building together, the shared history he thought belonged to both of them equally, and his place in a life they had constructed over 2 decades. His silence through all these years was not an empty void, but an active choice, a refusal to allow his private pain to be consumed and exploited by a public that treats royal scandal as entertainment. But his decision to break that silence now, at age 85, is not motivated by revenge or a desire to damage anyone's reputation. Instead, it seems to be about providing context and ensuring that the historical record does not completely erase the human costs involved. Every grandeur love story celebrated in public has private casualties that are rarely acknowledged, and Andrew's willingness to finally tell his version of events serves as a reminder of that uncomfortable truth. If Andrew leaves behind any legacy through finally sharing his experience, it is this simple but important observation. Behind every celebrated union and every gilded moment of royal pageantry, there are private reckonings and personal sacrifices that remain invisible to those watching from outside.